All right, hey guys, we are going to be talking about civil rights this week. Going to be talking about, if I can change slides, Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and things like government policies on affirmative actions. It's things you may have heard about, but may not necessarily know about. For the sake of time, I'm not going to be talking about the history of these things, just the law on these things and how it applies today. Um, I apologize for getting these videos out late. Apparently, I've had just the kiss of death with technology this week. So we'll be offering extra points for anyone who watches these videos. I'll make them an Ed puzzle so I can see who to give those points to. All right. So civil rights is just an idea, are designed to protect people against discrimination from the government or from officials or even private individuals. This is on ground of race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, religion, national origin, anything, any kind of discrimination. This has been a huge struggle for the United States throughout our history, as I'm sure you are all aware. Equality is never mentioned in the original Constitution. It doesn't show up until the 14th Amendment, and that's why it's known as the Civil Rights Amendment. So there was a point in time in our history where African Americans weren't even considered citizens. So in Dred Scott versus Sanford, you may have heard of this. Scott was suing for his freedom when he moved to a free state, and the Supreme Court, rather than answering the slavery question, just said, can't sue, not a citizen. So we've come a long ways, all right? Eventually, we'd have passed the 13th Amendment, which would free the slaves and make slavery constitutionally illegal. And then we would move into the era of segregation. Oof. Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, after the Civil War, would say that people of color and white people needed separate but equal accommodations and legalized segregation across the country. Here's some facts about that case, if you're curious about the history of it. The Civil Rights era starts in the early 1950s with the overturning of Plessy versus Ferguson, with the ending of segregation in schools. Some more history there. Sorry, we don't have time for it. And that pushes on into the 1960s movements that I'm sure most all of you are familiar with. This is where you see Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King becoming huge figures. The Civil Rights Act makes racial discrimination in public places illegal. You can't hire people based on race. Most of our ideas on you can't do that because of race come from this. Another group we want to look at in this is the right to vote for women. So voting rights have always been key to civil rights. Even after the 15th and the 19th Amendment gave people the rights to vote, there are still things like poll taxes, which is having to pay money in order to vote. If you didn't have the money to vote, you couldn't vote. We called these a poll tax, and the 24th Amendment to the Constitution ended this. 24th. We only have 27 of them, guys. This is getting pretty recent in our history. Even further back, you had only white primaries. So African Americans were given the right to vote, but only whites could vote in the primaries. So choosing who would be on the final ticket. We also had literacy tests. If you couldn't prove that you could read, you couldn't vote. And while there's a certain amount of a logic to if you can't read, how can you read the ballot? That is unallowable. There can't be any limitations to letting people vote or not. And we would eventually solve and correct these issues. All right. So actually going to skip that last slide. Every group in American history has had to fight for voting rights. Native American, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans. Asian Americans had a particularly hard time in the 1940s or after World War II. Because in World War II, Japanese Americans and many other Asian Americans were forced into internment camps during the war because we were afraid that they might choose to side with their native Japan. And as you can imagine, historically, this is one of the biggest black eyes in our history. These people were forced from their homes. All their property was taken. When they eventually were released from these camps, they returned to nothing. Not while they were there, their rights to vote were taken, and they were effectively all prisoners there. They had no choice but to be there. It was forced. Sorry, hang on, I have to sneeze. I'm gonna pause this. So that right to vote, we take it for granted today, but there was a lot of fight throughout our history that went into it. The 19th Amendment happened in 1920, but even through the 60s, the laws surrounding women were designed to keep women in the home and promote ideas of motherhood and protect men from women in terms of competition. And if that sounds messed up, it's kind of messed up. And it took a long time for the United States to get past this. All right. Eventually, in the 1970s, we would rule that any discrimination based on gender violated the 14th Amendment's equal protection. Hooray. In the 80s, it was actually pushed for a constitutional amendment for equal rights for all, especially women. It came very close to passing and becoming a constitutional amendment, and it only failed by 3 states. So, fun fact. So some places that we still see these battles being fought, even to this day, are largely like in the workplace. The Civil Rights Acts of 1964 banned gender as a discrimination for employment, but it didn't say anything about discrimination based on wage. And so you still see a wage gap that exists, and it's not nearly as bad as what it used to be. We are now, it's getting closer, and in some cases, women are paid, in many states, women are actually paid more than men on average, but that doesn't mean it's across the board that it's better. Women are allowed into the military now. However, they are not allowed to see combat roles. So there are still fights happening, things that you all might want to look into, but I'm going to have to move on for the sake of time. So a new front in the civil rights movement has to do with what we call the graying of America. The population of America is rapidly aging, with a majority of Americans being seniors. We see this happening in other parts of the world as well, with the baby boomer generation getting older. And that's created its own issues and questions of civil rights in like regards to, can age be used as a measure of discrimination in employment or in benefits in any other kind of way? Or can there be age classifications on things in the law, or is that discrimination? And that's become quite the issue today. One that we don't talk about much in schools because youth tend to not be concerned about age discrimination because they're not elderly. But it just doesn't make it just as much of an issue. So another issue that we're pretty familiar with today is the issue of LGBTQ plus rights. It wasn't until the early 2000s that we really start seeing progress being made on this issue, ending in 2013 with the allowance of same-sex marriage in all 50 states. However, that doesn't mean that there aren't still issues. I'm glossing over this, I know, and I'm sorry. Just for the sake of time, I'm sorry, guys. All right, so affirmative action. Affirmative action is this idea that people should be given special compensations or considerations based on previous wrongs. So one of the first places we start to see this is in schools, and where in these prestigious schools in America, you see them predominantly being white. And so these schools start making policies that require quotas, or the school has to accept so many students from various different groups, ethnic groups, cultural groups, and they start setting numbers of like that they have to reach. You actually see the state of California eventually ban this and declaring that even while well-intentioned, these types of rules are unconstitutional because it is discriminating based on gender or race or sex, just to try and make these goals or trying to fix the problem. So well-intentioned sometimes ruled unconstitutional. So can schools like admit students based on race? Big question in the modern world. Same thing in employment. For a long time, white people had more access to jobs. And so should jobs be required to have quotas on how many people of color they have to hire? How many women do they have to hire? And you see them forcing the hire of these people. And this is going to meet a lot of scrutiny. People are going to call this reverse racism or reverse discrimination. Other people are going to say this is how you fix the problem and force people to accept people of color or women or people who are just simply different into the workforce. Now we say it has to be tailored to meet a compelling government interest. So it's just this really narrow allowances. So it doesn't ban it, but it limits its reach. How much can it really be put into practice? Which is complicated for sure. A lot of people see this as the beginning of the end of affirmative action. So, actually going to skip over this slide. This is the argument against why we should legislate for like affirmative action and civil rights. Here is an argument for. Again, I'm going to go on past this. My question to you is affirmative action reverse discrimination? Or is affirmative action necessary to make people fix the problems of the past? Does it make things right? Does it give everyone an equal shot? Hopefully we'll have a chance to talk about this in class next week. So I hope you all watch this video. So in summary, I'm gonna move my face. In summary, civil rights and equality has been a struggle for our country. Constitutional amendments and civil rights laws have guaranteed voting rights and freedom from discrimination, and civil rights have expanded to many new groups over time. Last slide. It's important to note equality favors majority rule. Suffrage meaning the right to vote, gives many more groups political power. It is also worth noting that civil rights laws increase the size of the government and the power of the government. So in order to enforce these laws, you have to make the government more powerful. And it's the point of civil rights to protect individuals against discrimination. All right, guys, thanks for tuning in. Check out my next video on citizenship.